Hi, everybody. So as we all know, on-site operations are getting more and more complex, and the data that we're trying to track keeps expanding. We have parking permits and pet information and rentable items like garages and storage. So I am thrilled to have Nicole Schook here today, Associate Director of Operations, Technology, and Marketing, which is a lot, by the way, of Eagle Rock Properties. And she's going to help us talk about how incomplete or bad data can create problems on site and how they are taking on that issue by centralizing that data to ensure data accuracy. Data can be a tricky topic. And so, Nicole, thank you so much for joining us. So we can kind of take this nebulous concept of data and make it more tangible so we can all get our arms around it. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Brent. I'm happy to be here.
So let's dig right into it. I know that data can mean a lot of different things for a lot of different people and tasks. Can you break down a few examples of challenges you all face when it comes to having incorrect or incomplete data?
Yeah, definitely. I think data is really hard to track if you don't track it properly, and incomplete or inaccurate data or systems is sometimes even worse, right? So if you're trying to make decisions and operating steps and best practices and looking for revenue, if you only have half of the population or you're missing pieces or you're missing philosophies, you can't make those decisions properly. So making sure that you have everything in one place where you can report on it, where you can view it, where you know it's accurate, you have buy-in from your teams to enter in that place is incredibly important so you can take those next steps. So as an example, because I always like to give examples, if you're looking at parking permits like you spoke about before, if you only have half of your population in your operating system for permits and the other half in a different system, you would probably assume that you're missing money or you're missing tracking or you don't know what vehicles are in the lot and who has what permit and you have a towing issue. So, I mean, that's just a quick assumption as to what could happen, but it's a very minute process that we all have to work on and we all have involved in our operation. So even something that small of an operation could really impact you significantly if your data is not centralized and accurate.
Absolutely. So before you all started centralizing the data, how were properties tracking, parking permits or that type of data, and how was that causing problems specifically?
I think in our industry, there's a lot of spreadsheets around, and now with new technologies like OneDrive and SharePoint and Teams, there's just information everywhere. And you may have one thing like a parking permit where you have a spreadsheet in Excel and you have a form in Teams and you have something else on paper and you have a sticky on a wall, which I am an offender of myself for processes. But if you have this data everywhere, you can't even aggregate it to figure out how to put it into the system. So all of those different systems are great for operations, but they are hard when you're trying to consolidate if you don't know where to look.
Yeah, absolutely. My team makes fun of me for liking spreadsheets so much. So I love them, but I totally understand because then you have different issues with, version tracking and who's been in that, who saved what, and then if the data gets, corrupted, then you have backups. Yeah, it's a huge mess at that point, right?
100%. And then you have you and I updating spreadsheets at different times. Who's got the right one? Where is it? Is it saved? What if you lose it? I mean, it's a hardship for sure.
So let's talk about, you're looking to centralize the data. Can you put it in layman's terms what that actually means?
So when you centralize data, and there's so many operations that we've centralized, I'm just thinking of the best solution to explain. But when you're centralizing data, I think it's like a regular project. It's project management, I would think, at its easiest explanation. So you have to figure out how you can aggregate all of that data. So like we spoke about before, spreadsheets and OneDrive and Teams, where do you get all that information from? And I think once you can pinpoint where everything is, then it's always like a scrub process. That's what I call it here. So now you have 4 or 5 spreadsheets or 4 or 5 documents to consolidate. Now you have to make sure that information is right before you start building your central system. So if you are importing bad data, then you are starting the process poorly because you have to clean what you just did in the system. and your centralization is already kind of on the rocks because you have to now clean it. You're going to have an issue with getting buy-in from your residents or from your team members, depending on what it is. So it's always, in my opinion, a multi-step process. You find the data, you confirm it's right, you figure out how to build it into the system, and then usually you import it. So depending on what type of system you're looking to centralize, ideally, I think you'd want to import the system. So if you have all this data in a spreadsheet that you've aggregated and solved for, you import it into your operating system, but there may be some touch points that you can't import, so you have to have a team to manually enter those values. But that sometimes can be a hardship too. Like, we don't want to import, or we don't want to manually adjust. We want it to just be in the system, but it's not always a perfect solution. The perfect solution is getting it to the end, which is centralizing it and making it perfect at the end of the process with import plus manual entry. So we use Rent Manager as our operating system. There is an import feature, so we try and import as much as we can into those modules, but it also depends on what you're looking to do in the system. If you're making something custom for yourself, or if you're using a pre-built solution, what's the difference between those systems? But that's also part of the project, is how are you going to put this information into the system to confirm the consolidation and the centralization of the data.
So let's say on the parking side of things. So you have to build up your kind of your mapping, right? What fields you have for every situation, or like you have a resident with a parking, like what different fields are included that you want to pull in data wise. And then at that point, once you have the data fields created as far as a structure, then you need to think about the importing of existing data, right? Is that what you're telling me?
That's right. So if you have the systems that you know you want to use, right? So let's say you're just tracking parking permits. If there's 2 or 3 residents, that may change your scope, right? Because you have to import 2 or 3 times to that resident account. So you have to make sure that you have the foundation that accounts for all the variations, because you're not just going to import one permit number. You may import 5 or 10, depending on your property or your residents. So trying to identify what the volume is that you need for those fields is really step one, and then making sure those imports attach and map to those fields. So you're importing to the right area, because the worst thing that could happen is you import hundreds of lines of data into your system and it's in the wrong place. And then, as usually the administrator, you have to wipe it all out and start over, and you never want to have to kind of work backwards.
Definitely been there. I've done that.
Same.
Yes. Okay. So, and then as far as you have this data, do you all do? I'm assuming some sort of auditing process to make sure that your existing data now into this new centralized platform within Rent Manager is now correct. Are you doing that, or are you having the on-site team members do that auditing process, or is it a mix of both?
It's usually a mix of both. So if I'm responsible for importing the data and managing the project, which is usually what happens, I will always say, I believe this is 99% accurate. I've checked it, I've audited it, I've looked at my import records and my original working documents versus the output results, and I know that there's a match on just about 99% of the time. But I also like to empower the teams to say, you are responsible for this. This is your data that I used. Please check and make sure that this is accurate. So even something as massive, right, as like buying a community and importing that property into the system, that's also a data check, because you never want to bill or you never want to set up a property incorrectly. It's all centralized in the same solution. So you always have to check. I always check myself, but I also empower the teams to check and say, yes, we also agree, just as a double check, that you may be looking at hundreds of lines, that those hundreds of lines are right.
So in one of our earlier conversations about data, and I'm sure people are thinking what nerds they are, but I love data, and I love hearing how you approach this challenge. You had mentioned the concept of move-in and move-out wizards, and how that helps on-site team members then dial in to make sure that all the data is accurate. Can you explain what that is and how you will use those wizards?
Yes. So any type of customization, I'm all for, just about all the time. So the move-in and move-out wizards is something that we recently started to look into, because we have, of course, like every other client or every other management company, we have hundreds of operations. It's not as simple as just accepting rent checks and sending out leases. I mean, there's a gamut of things that go behind property management rather. So the move in, move out wizards kind of enforce the policy. So if you have hundreds of staff or if you have thousands of tenants, you have to make sure your processes are strong enough to be able to move these processes forward. So the move in and move out wizards really for us confirm the requirements that are in the system. So did you get the renter's insurance? Please enter it. Did you get the utility information and the account numbers? Please enter it. Did you get the parking permit? Did you provide a parking permit? What's the parking permit number? So all of that is in the system as a requirement before that prospect even really matriculates into a tenant. So we're really trying to identify best practices and use the system as our kind of our fail-safe to say we know that we're getting the information. We have a high level of confidence because we're requiring it. Now, if somebody enters the wrong thing, that's just a margin of error that we can't always account for, but at least we know that we're taking the steps and building that roadmap to say we're in compliance 99% of the time because we're asking for it up front. Or on the other end, when they move out.
As we kind of started this section, one of the things I mentioned was that on-site teams are so overloaded and overwhelmed already. So how do you all get buy-in from your on-site teams to understand that this is going to be a good thing? Like they will want to actually be a part of having better data and actually buy into that idea and actually take the steps necessary versus it being a, us against them mentality. Oh, they want us to do something more or additional or whatever. How do you get that buy-in?
Well, I have to tell you, I think buy-in is something I learned very early on in my career. And I honestly think I was very lucky because our team is really upfront and they're very forward and they're very positive about a lot of the things that are happening. There's a lot of changes that people are like, this is never going to work because we've done it like this for 20 or 30 or all these years and we know how it's done. But I think when you get that buy-in and when you come with a very positive attitude, like this is going to change and this is why, and you start to develop beta groups, which is what I always rely on. So when you really present these campaigns in a positive light and you explain the benefits and the reasoning behind it, it's not like you're just forcing a system enhancement, which is sometimes what the admins feel, right? We're like, oh my gosh, something new we have to roll out, but we know at the end of the day it's going to help the teams. So getting that buy-in, setting up those focus groups, but also allowing people to buy into it and saying, we are going to roll out 10 campaigns. Do you want to be a part of any of them? Do you want to be a part of all of them? And letting team members decide what they really want to provide their insight to, I think goes a long way with the entire group.
So you're saying that it's kind of opt-in beta testers or beta properties? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, beta properties, have those team members buy in. If it's maybe just a property management initiative where it's the property managers that have to absorb a policy change, then it will be a beta test for those property managers at a few properties. But if it's a larger adjustment that affects really the entire portfolio or the entire staff, then we try and get a little bit more insight from different roles to see what their opinions are.
Love it. That's fantastic. Okay, so now we've kind of walked through what the challenges are. Now you've kind of centralized it into Rent Manager. Now you have all this data. And what I really want to hear is how are you using it? How is it impacting your operations? You can pull reporting, I'm assuming. You can do notifications. So what are you doing to improve operations now that you have this data that's hopefully much better?
It's a great question. It's what I always lead with when I explain in my beta groups how we're going to make sure that this works going forward. But we are really able to build best practices because we have all this data in one place. I am a big proponent of automating reports. So there are team members that get reports from me on a daily basis with new things. So as an example, here's your parking permit report for the week. Is this correct? Did you enter all your move-ins? Here's your move-in report, and here's the missing permits that may not be in the system. So we're able to say, we know that this is right from the beginning, and now we have to manage it to make sure it remains right. So there's so many different opportunities you have when you centralize data, automatically notifying residents of certain things or things expiring in the system that we can now report on. So it's really reporting, auditing, and also best practices. You're able to make those next positions and bring your company to a different level because you have that data at your fingertips.
That's fantastic. Nicole, thank you so much for joining us today to talk about the Big Data Challenge. That's been very insightful on how to approach different data challenges and then ultimately what you can get out of it from a positive change in operations. So thank you for joining us. And everybody, we hope you're enjoying this series. We have more in store for you. So have a great one.